From communion with the dead to pumpkins and pranks, Halloween is a patchwork holiday stitched together with cultural, religious, and occult traditions that span centuries. It all began with the Celts, a people whose culture had spread across Europe more than 2,000 years ago. October 31st was the day they celebrated the end of the harvest season in a festival called Samhain. That night also marked the Celtic New Year and was considered a time between years, a magical time when the ghost of the dead walked the earth.
It was the time when the veil between death and life was supposed to be at its thinnest.
On Samhain, the villagers gathered and lit huge bonfires to drive the dead back to the spirit world and keep them away from the living. But as the Catholic Church's influence grew in Europe, it frowned on the pagan rituals like Samhain. In the 7th century, the Vatican began to merge it with a church-sanctioned holiday. So November 1st was designated All Saints' Day to honor martyrs and the deceased faithful.
Both of these holidays had to do with the afterlife and about survival after death. It was a calculated move on the part of the church to bring more people into the fold.
All Saints' Day was known then as Hallowmas. Hallow means holy or saintly, so the translation is roughly Mass of the Saints. The night before, October 31st, was All Hallows' Eve, which gradually morphed into Halloween. The holiday came to America with the wave of Irish immigrants during the potato famine of the 1840s. They brought several of their holiday customs with them, including bobbing for apples and playing tricks on neighbors, like removing gates from the front of houses. The young pranksters wore masks so they wouldn't be recognized. But over the years, the tradition of harmless tricks grew into outright vandalism.
Back in the 1930s, it really became a dangerous holiday. I mean, there was such hooliganism and vandalism. Trick-or-treating was originally an extortion deal. Give us candy or we'll trash your house.
Storekeepers and neighbors began giving treats or bribes to stop the tricks, and children were encouraged to travel door to door for treats as an alternative to troublemaking. By the late 30s, trick or treat became the holiday greeting.
You were like, but when I was growing up, as kids, we celebrated Halloween, around the streets. They were talking about Hallows' Eve. My granny never talked about Halloween. She always talked about Hallow Eve, and that was how she knew it. But I mean, in those days, it still had the connotation of, the Celtic festival and this kind of thing. But it seemed an awful lot more innocent than the way it has become now, where it really is so terribly dark and very, very sinister. But it does definitely go back to the Celts. The Irish word for the month of November is Mi Nasawa, and that is where we get the term for Halloween, Samhain, because it marks the original Celtic New Year, and Samhain was the celebration of the end of the harvest and entering into the winter, with all the beliefs about spirits and gods and all that kind of thing that went along with it. So it was very much part of the Celtic year, and as you're aware, the church, when it encountered this, as with other festivals from paganism, it adopted them, transformed them, and tried to give a kind of a Christian veneer to the pagan festivals. We were talking a few weeks ago about Christmas, and that is another kind of example of how a pagan festival was taken over and Christianized by the Roman Catholic Church. and they did exactly the same with Halloween. And one of the things about Ireland is that, you know, through the years, Catholic priests often complained about the fact that, you know, they had managed as a church to evangelise or Christianise the Irish, but they had never been able to get paganism out of the Irish. So it was always tolerated as something that was always under the surface. It never went away, and there would be a lot of popular beliefs in Ireland, particularly in rural parts of Ireland, still today, that go away back to those pagan roots. But it was for the Celts the time of the year when the veil that existed between our world and the other world was at its thinnest. And you hear people talk about that's a thin place. Well, this was a thin time of the year when they believed the spirits were able to cross over and come back again, with all that could have meant. For some, it meant that it was the spirits of the departed loved ones being able to come in among you and celebrate with you, and you know you missed them, and so it was good to have a time in the year when you could welcome them back again. And very often in rural Ireland, an empty chair was left by the fire in their homes, just as a symbol of the fact that the person was missing and that they were allowing the house to be open for their spirit to return at Samhain. And other homes would have lit a candle and placed it in a window to mark the fact that the home was open for the visit of the expected spirits. And it was only later that people began to cut turnips out and make them in the face of like a demon, some kind of a scary face, and put a candle in it and put it on their windowsill to scare away any evil spirits. You know, they were happy for the familiar spirits to come, but evil spirits, no, they were to stay away. So you put the turnip with the candle in and a scary face to keep the spirits away, as if that was going to be effective. And the funny thing is that, you know, trick or treating, which would be very much an American thing, but in Ireland the tradition was to dress up and to put on, we used to call them in when I was growing up, we called them false faces. And you put a false face on because that was meant to fool any evil spirits, and they wouldn't know it was you, so you couldn't be attacked because they didn't know who was behind the false face and who was dressed up in these clothes that they weren't familiar with. So it was all to do with the other world and the spirits passing over and returning into our world. And the thing is that all of this has been coming back big time in the past number of years, you know, with the number of TV shows to do with talking to the dead, communicating with the departed, all this kind of stuff, like Ghost Whisperer, or there's a show called Medium, another one called Supernatural. I haven't actually seen any of them, but I've seen them advertised, and it's all part of this interest in anything to do with the other world and what we would know as the occult. So what does the Bible say about these things? Well, the Bible's very clear. It's unequivocal about the fact that we must never seek to enter into contact with the spirit world, with the unseen realm. It's strictly forbidden to us. For example, in Leviticus chapter 19 verse 31, it says this: "Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." A prohibition, complete and total. Another verse that speaks about this is Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 10 and 12. And it reads like this. God says to the Hebrews, "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire." Now we're talking about Deuteronomy, and that's before they actually entered the promised land. They were preparing to enter, and already then God was warning them against sacrificing sons or daughters in the fire. And in actual fact, they didn't obey that, and that was one of the abominations that led God to cast them out of the land in the end. At the time of Jeremiah, he was railing against this kind of practice that was happening amongst the people of Judah, and had been happening in Israel as well. Hard to imagine that they sank as low as that. And continuing in Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 to 12, God says, "Let no one be found who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord." God wanted and wants still to protect his people against the harm that comes from contact with the spirit world, and so the interdiction is complete and total. You must have nothing to do with that. Imagine what it was like for the church where I did my pastoral assistantship when I was studying theology. There was a church in Belfast off the Lisburn Road, Windsor Baptist Church, and right beside our church building there was a spiritualist church. And we often felt the impact of that, and when we met before services, deliberately prayed against the effects of being right up next again. I think we actually shared a wall with this spiritualist church. We prayed for the people who were going there, because so many who had lost loved ones and wanted to try and get in contact with them, and that's why they were going there. But we were very much aware of a battle that was going on and had to pray against it. And God is very clear in the Bible that we must have no contact whatsoever with these things. The term that we attach to all of that is occult. And that comes from a Latin word occultus, that means simply hidden. That which is hidden is deliberately hidden from us. God doesn't want us to see it. One of my favourite verses is again from Deuteronomy, chapter 29, verse 29, where God says, "The hidden things are for him alone. The revealed things are for us and for our children, but the hidden things are for him alone to know." We should therefore never make any attempt to find out about things that he has kept hidden from us. And to venture there is really playing on dangerous grounds. The fact is that Satan is powerful. He's not called the God of this world for nothing. He is mighty, and we have not to venture into his territory ever at all. And that's why in the New Testament, in terms of our opposition to the hidden world, to the occult world, we can never stand in our own strength. We have to stand in the strength that God gives us and with the armour that God gives us, which is why Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Paul is very much aware of the fact that what happens all around us is not just an earthly, fleshly thing. There are demonic forces behind what's happening, which I think is helpful for us in terms of what we are facing at the moment, and as we were praying, the increase of darkness and how to counter it. We've got to realise this is inevitable. It is bound to happen because we're warned that it's going to happen. And if you, like me, at times get very angry when you read about what people are doing, and particularly the globalist elites are doing, and you look at it on a superficial level and on a very fleshly level, you really need, like I have to do with myself, take a step back and say, the most really I can do is pray about these things. Pray for the repentance, if possible, of some of the people involved in these things, if possible, and leave their judgment in the hands of God, and try and speak to people and warn them about what's happening. But this is all very much part of the spiritual battle that's going on. If you want to read some books that give a very good idea of what the spiritual battle is like, I can recommend nothing better than what is called the Space Trilogy, written by C.S. Lewis. People think it's a science fiction thing, and that turns them off because, I'm not into science fiction. It's not really science fiction at all. It's actually a spiritual allegory. And he wrote 3 books in a trilogy. It's not an Irish trilogy with 2 books, but it's actually it's 3 books in a trilogy, and they give such a clear illustration of what spiritual warfare is like. Particularly the second book, which is called Perelandra, is a fantastic illustration of what demonic possession is like. And the last book, called That Hideous Strength, is almost like a blueprint for what's beginning to happen in our day, where the science becomes the new religion and creates chaos across the country, and there are only a few who realise what's going on and stand against it. Amazing books. That the Space Trilogy. The Space Trilogy. The first book is called Out of the Silent Planet. Then there's Perelandra, and the third is That Hideous Strength. And actually C.S. Lewis was quite a visionary about what was going to happen in the future, because he made warnings about the lengths to which science would go and technology and the dangers of totalitarianism coming from these things. But we can only stand against the powers of darkness in the power of Christ and with the armour that God gives us to put on. And that means that we've got to be very careful about ourselves. Paul says, and it's still in the book of Ephesians, in Ephesians 4:27, Paul says this, and the context is to do with resolving anger between Christians. And Paul says this in that context: do not give the devil a foothold. But we can take that and apply it much more widely, not only to disputes that arise among Christians, but on a much wider basis for all aspects of life. He's saying to believers, do not give the devil a foothold. If he's saying that to believers, that presupposes that we can give the devil a foothold. And a foothold is a Greek word, topos, that gives us words like topological or topography and things like that. It's to do with a place, and we can give Satan a place in our lives by our attitudes. And Satan is very much like those nightmare salesmen who try to come around your door and put a foot in the door so that you can't close it, and they can give you their spiel and sell you something. Satan will get his foot in the door, and he won't stay there. He'll want to go in deeper and deeper and deeper, and we can give them that opportunity to do so. I'm not talking about satanic possession of the believer, but we can open ourselves to satanic influence and almost invite him. And we've got to be very, very careful about that, especially when we know that by the power of the Spirit in us, we can actually learn to resist the devil, which is why we're told that we must submit ourselves to God and resist the devil so that he will flee from us. Not give him a foothold, but deliberately submit to God, and with the armour of God cause the devil to flee, and therefore have the strength to stand against him. But all of this that I've been saying is not actually the main point that I want to talk about this morning, because it's kind of been the preliminary to something else that I want us to look at in the book of Matthew. So if you have your Bible, can I ask you to look up Matthew chapter 16? Because what I do want to major on is what we see in Matthew 16 of the fact that Christ and Christ alone brings defeat to the powers of darkness. The powers of darkness that we see especially around the time of Halloween, when it all comes out in the open. And I mean, it's shocking sometimes to see some of the way people are decorating their homes. A number of homes that I walk past, and I'm nearly certain there must be children in the homes, but they have these things up where there are people, at the window, help, that kind, and I've walked past those and I've thought, knowing the kind of child abuse that goes on and the satanic rituals where young children are abused, if only people in those homes realised what they were doing. It's almost like inviting the enemy to come in, and it just is so horrible. But this passage in Matthew chapter 16 is wonderful for showing us the victory of Christ over the powers of darkness. So let me read from Matthew 16 verse 13 to 18 and pay attention to the geography of where we're at in this passage. Verse 13 says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. That's important for us to remember. Caesarea Philippi. He asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And that last verse will be the main one that I want us to consider. Let me reread it. I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gate of Hades will not overcome it. You're all familiar with the fact that the Roman Catholic Church will take this verse, and because of the fact that Simon Peter's name in Greek would be Petros for Peter, and there's another word used in this same verse in the Greek, Petra, and both of those words, Petros and Petra, come from the Greek word for rock or a rock. And so it's often believed within the Catholic Church that this was Christ instituting Peter as the rock on which he would build his church, and therefore Peter was the first pope. And there has been papal succession ever since, following in the footsteps of Peter. We'll see that it's not at all the case that Jesus is saying here, but you'll also, by what I plan to share this morning, discover that there's another interpretation that you may not have come across before, which to me seems the most likely. And much of what I'm sharing with you this morning has to do with teachings that I've come across in a book called The Unseen Realm by an American scholar called Dr. Michael Heiser, who has some fascinating insights into a lot of things that form part of the background of the ancient Hebrew way of looking at spiritual things, the unseen realm in particular. But let me start by saying, by emphasizing the fact that this verse does not say about Christ building his church that the gates of hell will not overcome it. The word hell is not used here. The word is Hades, and there's a difference. There are two words that are used in the New Testament by Jesus to talk about the afterlife, or the place of the departed spirits. One of these places is Hades, and the other place is Gehenna. Unfortunately, these are two words that our English translations haven't retained in the original, which is a pity because it would enable us to distinguish between the two places. But we generally just use the term hell for both, and it's not accurate. It's not what is being depicted. The word Hades that's used in this verse is a Greek word, and it's the Greek equivalent of what in the Old Testament is called Sheol. Sheol you will come across, particularly in the Psalms. You'll find the word Sheol mentioned quite a lot. And in actual fact, in the ancient Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament, the word Sheol is nearly always replaced by Hades in the Greek. So the two are basically meaning the same thing. And it signified, certainly in the sense of Hades in the Greek world, it signified the place of the dead, the holding place of the spirits of the departed, if you like. And therefore, the word Hades was always connected in people's minds with the concept of death, the end of life in our world, and the continuance of life in the next through the passage of death, the world of the dead, the underworld. There's another term also used of it. And it was believed by many in the time of Jesus that the dead went there, but that this place had two different compartments. One compartment for the spirits of the righteous dead who departed, and another compartment for the spirits of the wicked. And Jesus makes allusion to this in his story about the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16, where the rich man and Lazarus go to Hades. He refers to the part of Hades where Lazarus, the poor man, goes as being in the bosom of Abraham. And there's a chasm between the two compartments that cannot be crossed. The rich man who dies in judgment is in the part of the underworld reserved for the wicked, and Lazarus is in that part reserved for the righteous. Hades is the term that Jesus uses in that story. And it's believed by many Christians that after Christ rose from the dead, the souls of the righteous no longer go into Hades, but are taken directly into the presence of God in his heavenly domain, which is why Paul will say absent from the body but present with the Lord. He's directly in God's presence, and many believers believe that after his resurrection, Jesus emptied the compartment of Hades that was reserved for the righteous and took them to heaven, and ever after there is no Hades for the spirits of departed righteous Christians. I haven't got time to go into all that and justify whether that's correct or not. Something that you can look up yourselves at home. But what I do want to do with you this morning is think about this place where we're actually at and where Jesus actually pronounces these things. Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi. It was an old city that was built on a rock formation at the foot, or at least very near, Mount Heron. I mentioned earlier that Robert spoke about a mountain last week, and we're going to speak about another mountain a bit today, Mount Heron, where Caesarea Philippi was built in northern Israel. It got its name from Caesar Augustus, who gave the city to Herod the Great in 20 BC. And Herod's son renamed the city in honour of Augustus. So it became Caesarea Augustus, Caesarea Philippi, because its name was changed in honour of the emperor. The son of Herod who renamed it was called Philip. So you have both Caesar and Philip together. Caesarea Philippi. But the original name of the city was Paneas. Now, Paneas. Some of you who know anything about Greek mythology will spot the name of a Greek god there. Anybody know what it is? Pan. The god Pan. The city had been built in honour of the Greek god Pan. And if some of you read up about the Greek gods in the past, you know that Pan was a strange kind of looking character with the half of his body like a goat, and the upper part like a man with horns coming out of his head, and quite goat-like in appearance, which is nothing strange when we know the kind of images that are used for the likes of Baphomet and you know, satanic figures and all that kind of thing. But Pan was the one who was honoured in this city of Paneas, built upon this rocky area at the foot of Mount Hermon. And in the city of Paneas there was a temple dedicated to Pan, which was built near the site of a cave and a spring. And the cave was a deep cave, which tied in very much with the mythology to do with Pan, because he was one of the few Greek gods that was believed were able to pass out of this world into the other world, into Hades, and back and forward again. So he could come back and forward at wish. And Pan was honoured for being able to do this. And every year in Paneas they would have held a festival to Pan in an effort to try and welcome him back and bring him back. And they did abominable practices. If I tell you, because you know we've spoken about what Pan was supposed to look like, part goat, part man. Some of the practices that they did involved relations between humans and goats in efforts to bring Pan back from Hades into our world. So it was a place of abomination. And that would have been known widely at the time of Jesus. And Jesus chooses to bring his disciples here and make that declaration in this very place, at a place where pagans believed this was a portal to the other world, to Hades. So they would have been aware of this, the disciples, and they must have been quite shocked that Jesus brought them to this area. It was kind of if you've ever been to Amsterdam, as soon as you get off the train in the main station, you're almost immediately into the red light district. You can't avoid it. And there's such a feeling of darkness in the place. And you can imagine that they probably picked up the vibes on this, being in something that was like the equivalent of a red light district in our culture. And Christ chose this location to make this declaration about the church. But there were other reasons coming from their own history that would have made them wary of where they were at the foot of Mount Hermon in this particular place. Very close by to here, at Dan, King Jeroboam, who was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel after the split, King Jeroboam of Israel built a pagan religious centre at Dan, where the Israelites could worship Baal, for example, instead of the Lord. The disciples would have known that they were very close to that area there. But Mount Hermon, where they were, was significant for other reasons. The region of Mount Hermon was also known in the Old Testament as Bashan. Bashan, B-A-S-H-A-N. And it was a place with a very sinister reputation. At the time when the Israelites were about to enter into Canaan, the region of Bashan was controlled by two kings, Sihon and Og. If you read your Old Testament and the whole history of the battles in Canaan, you'll come across Sihon and Og of Bashan. Sihon and Og were associated with the peoples known as the Rephaim and the Anakim. And the Rephaim and the Anakim, mentioned in the Old Testament, were giant clans. Which explains why when the 12 spies went into Canaan and came back with the report, we are like grasshoppers in their sight. This was not some symbolical language that they were using. This was literal. We are tiny compared with these folks, because these folks were giants. Now, they're not the kind of giants the size of a house, but very, very, very tall people. And Bashan was the region of the Rephaim and Anakim giant clans. And when you speak about giants in the Old Testament context, what immediately comes to mind? For those, and I have to say it, for those not of a Protestant Reformed tradition, but for everybody else who reads Genesis chapter 6 as it should be read and understood, it reminds you of the Nephilim. Bashan, Hermon. According to Jewish tradition, and you find this in the book of Enoch notably, Mount Hermon, again remember in the region of Bashan, was where the divine sons of God that we read of in Genesis 6 came down and then went out to women of human descent, ordinary human women, married human women, reproduced with human women. And of course, if you're talking about a mating between celestial and terrestrial beings, you're not going to come up with ordinary offspring. And they didn't come up with ordinary offspring. They gave birth to the Nephilim, meaning giants. Some people will say, no, it means the fallen ones. But etymologically, it really means giants. And in actual fact, that ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament I mentioned earlier translates the word Nephilim, saying that they were gigantes, they were gigantic, they were giants. And that's what the word refers to. And the Rephaim and the Anakim, who were still in Canaan at the time, were connected with these Nephilim. The flood obviously got rid of mankind and the creatures that were living on the earth, but we're told in Genesis 6 that the Nephilim were on the earth at the time of Noah and afterwards. And that's why we still find them in Canaan when the Israelites are about to invade. So the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men were the Nephilim. And another thing about the Nephilim is that, again, according to ancient tradition, and apparently it's in the Book of Enoch, although I haven't actually read the section that talks about it, but it explains this tradition, the origin of demons, that the demons would come from the Nephilim who died, and their spirits became demons. And that would be the origin of the idea of demons, because these were no ordinary spirits. These were the spirits of the offspring between the sons of God and the daughters of men. So all of that kind of thing was mixed up in what people believed about this area, about Mount Hermon, about Bashan, where Caesarea Philippi was built, and where there had been a temple to Pan, near this cave that gave access to Hades, as people thought, and by a spring built on rocks at the foot of the mountain. And this is where Jesus declares war. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the significance of all that area represented? So, let me reread the verse. And I want to read it from the Amplified Bible. And bear in mind again that Hades is not hell. It's the underworld. It's the place of the dead. And according to the Amplified Bible, we have this reading. Jesus says, "You are Peter, Petros," meaning a large piece of rock. "And on this rock, Petra, a huge rock like the rock of Gibraltar, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades, the powers of the infernal region, shall not hold out against it." I'll reread that. "You are Peter, and on this rock, where we are, that represents the powers of Hades, the powers of the occult, the powers of the enemy, all connected with death, and death, as we know, is all connected with the enemy, having been brought in at the fall. On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, which this place represented, shall not hold out against it." It's a declaration of war in which Jesus says that his church is not, as many interpretations tend to view it, is not holding out against the attacks of the evil one. The church he is building is on the offensive. The church is attacking the powers of darkness. The church is fighting against all that Hades represents. And that church begins to be built when Christ rises from the dead and overcomes everything that has to do with death, including the wicked powers that are associated with death. So Jesus is taking the offensive. He's saying his church is going to persist. His church, built on this very rock that symbolizes death and all that death throws at people, he is overcoming it. And you, as his church, will overcome it with him against the powers of darkness. He was going to bury them by the power of his resurrection, and he would share the power of his resurrection with all of us in his church. So this statement by Jesus actually is one of the many statements in the New Testament that proclaim the victory of Christ. His victory over death, his victory over the devil, his victory over all that Hades represented in people's minds, and the fear that cast in their minds. And you know, one of the interesting things is about all of this geographical area, is that many people, now it can't be proven 100%, but many believe that Mount Hermon was in fact the mountain of transfiguration, where Jesus was changed to reveal his power, the appearance that he will have when he returns, that we see in the first chapter of Revelation, and what Peter, James and John saw on the top of the mountain. And if indeed it was Mount Hermon, would that not be so significant? This very place that the sons of God came down and brought all this corruption and caused so much chaos and havoc. And Jesus, if it was on this mountain, is saying, look, this is me taking it all back. I'm taking it all back, and my church is taking it back with me. And nothing will prevail against my church. And I want to share that with us this morning, because we can become so overwhelmed with the darkness that's increasing around us. We can be so overwhelmed at times to think there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. And in a sense, there is nothing we can do, because it's inevitable that it's going to happen. We're told these days are coming. But the victory is already proclaimed. And Christ proclaimed it here in the very place where you would least expect that kind of victory to begin. And he's saying it begins now. I am building my church. And if you're part of his church, you're part of his victory. You're going to have a complete share in all that he has won, including reigning with him on this earth when he comes back.